Welcome to the Remote AF live stream event for our Remote AF community. We are blessed today to have the wonderful Lisette Sutherland. She's a facilitator, author, speaker, and she's got the Work Together Anywhere book, handbook on working remotely and successfully. And not just to boot that, she's a wonderful person as well. Lisette, welcome today.
Thanks. I really appreciate being invited and to talk with people from all over the world. So and you've already had your Thursday. So how was Thursday? Was it a good? Right. I'm just starting, so we'll see. All right. Let's see, I guess. All right, so I've put together today, I've got a presentation that I've been working on as the world goes hybrid. And so I've been really thinking about what are the things that people are struggling with now, and what are some of the ways that we can solve that. And so I've entitled this presentation, If You Go Back to the Office, Don't Go Backwards in Time. And so I thought I would just focus on what that actually looks like. And we know, of course, that some of us really want to go back to the office, and we know that some of us really don't. But what everybody wants is the ability to choose. And so this whole new future of work, I say, is choice. We hear a lot that the future of work is remote, but I know that there's a lot of people that want to go back to the office. And so I say the future of work is choice. And it's choice for individuals to decide when and where they're most productive, and also choice for companies to decide how remote or hybrid that we want to be. And what we know is that right now, a lot of people, the one thing that people don't want to go back to the office for is because of the commute. It's like now that after the pandemic, people are starting to go back to the office and realizing that hour each way is just crazy, right? Like we can't. So some of the things that we're going back to is like they now seem crazy when we're doing it. So we're all sort of questioning, and I think most companies in the world are doing some form of hybrid. And what we see in terms of the landscape, we see that there are some companies that want to go back to the office, right? We've got the Elon Musks and the Goldman Sachs and then plenty of others, the Netflix in the beginning. But what we're also seeing there is that compliance is very low. At Goldman Sachs, on the first day when they had people come back, they had 50% compliance, and then we're seeing that kind of thing even with mandates. It's partially mandated, I would say. Even if companies really are saying that it's a mandate, the compliance rate is questionable. So then we've got the companies that do have mandates. It's like 2 or 3 days a week, or 8 days a month, or 10 days a quarter, all kinds of different things. We then have the situation where the team decides when and where they're going to work. And then we've got the companies that are going totally remote. They've gotten rid of offices and they're taking their workforce 100% remote. So I think WordPress is probably the most popular company doing that. But then there's also Simpress and Vistaprint, a number of very large corporations taking operations completely remote. And one of the things that I really like from Jurgen, he's got a quote, and he said from his book, Managing for Happiness, which I love, by the way. But he says, if you want an organizational structure that can handle the challenges of the 21st century, you need to ensure that there's practically no difference between a physical team and a virtual team. And indeed, I see, maybe I have to spotlight myself. I don't know, does that help? All right, I wasn't sure if I had to do it or if you guys had to do it. So I was assuming you guys had to do it. All right, there we go. So you can actually read the slides now. All right, so that's good. I'll go back to the other one where I show you the landscape. 1 second, so you can at least see what the landscape looked like rather than just big squiggly lines. All right, there was the landscape. So in general, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to go from an office first mindset, which is what we had before the pandemic, right? The office was the primary place that we went to get our work done. And we're now moving to a remote first environment where the office just becomes one of many places that we go to get our work done. And in fact, it's sort of turning more into a co-working space functionality, depending on which office you're in, than it was before. Now, there are some significant differences that happen for individuals, for teams, and for leaders as we go into this hybrid mode. And for the biggest change, I would say, for individuals is that we have to be more deliberate and conscientious about how we use our time. In Cal Newport's book, Deep, he says we have to be both on and off. So when we're on, being on and fully focused, and when we're off, really being off and giving our brains a break. Most of us are knowledge workers, and sorry, there's doorbells going off everywhere. So most of us are knowledge workers, and we need time for deep focus and concentrations, and we need to give our brains a rest. So really being on and off. What we saw during the pandemic was that productivity was not the issue. It was burnout. And part of that is because everybody had a hard time turning off. Now, the biggest change for teams is going from time-oriented working to results-oriented working. And we're adding place to the equation, right? So now instead of 9 to 5, we're going to results-oriented. And it sounds super easy because it's really easy to say, but the devil's in the details. I mean, if you think about how do you measure your own productivity, right? So, and how do you know if you're being productive in a day? And then we extrapolate it out. How do we measure our team's productivity? And things start to get complicated quickly. We've then also got this multimodal way of working, which is we are co-located and distributed, and we're asynchronous and we're synchronous, and that causes a whole bunch of different planning that is needed for teams, right? So if we're going into this multimodal way of working, we're going to have to do a lot more planning. And now the biggest change for leaders is more transparency in the system. As we go hybrid, our cultures require a little bit more documentation and a lot more transparency so that everybody understands what success looks like and how their role fits into the bigger picture. So really the focus on transparency, and that is in the ways that we're working, but also how we function as a company. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means as we go through the presentation. So those are sort of the biggest changes for individuals, teams, and leaders. And now in terms of the next thing that I want to focus on is I want to talk about, how we navigate this hybrid work environment. And I've come up with sort of 3 main areas to focus on. And that is 1, modifying how we're communicating with each other. The way that we did it before is not going to work now. We've seen that. We need to define what is normal behavior on our teams. And then we have to explore some new ways of being present with each other, right? Like, what does it mean to actually go to work in the modern day world? We're going to start with communication. And for that, I want to take you on a short tour of the office over time. And I want to start in the 1970s. And so I will preface this with, this may be a bit US bias because that is where I had my main office working experience, was when I lived in the US. So there may be some bias here, but I'm hoping that generally it'll apply to most situations around the world. This is in the 1970s. As you can see, we had the open office plans were really popular. And what was different then is that most of the furniture, it's hard to see, but the furniture is on wheels. So it was sort of modular. You could move things around as needed. And the ways, of course, that we knew where people were is we actually had these physical boards where you could write down if you were in or out or where you were, calendaring, right? Like, this is how we communicated to each other where we were if you weren't at your desk. So we had some of these things. We also had punch cards in the 70s, right? You'd punch in and you'd punch out. And that was fun. So then we moved to the 80s, and the open office plans, we suddenly turned into cubicle farms, right? People did value their walls and their privacy a little bit more. So then we just turned into these sort of cubicle farms that were there. And the way that we communicated with each other before email or even after email. And in fact, when I show this, some people are still doing it to this day. We have these interdepartmental memos. So you would put a physical memo into this envelope and then sign it when you've read it. And then after you've read it, you would put it in the mailbox for the next person to get it. And then they would read it and sign it if they read it, right? And then we got email and things exploded from there. Just to prove that I was there, this was my cubicle. This is me in the in the 90s working in my cubicle. I had long blonde hair then, but I just wanted to prove that I was actually there. Then we move into the 90s and the 2000s, and we go back to the open office plan. It suddenly becomes popular again. And in fact, 80% of the offices in the US were and are now open plan offices. And then when we go to the 2010s, we get the open plan offices, but suddenly they look really hip and cool because the technology firms are starting to come into the picture, and Twitters and the Facebooks and the Googles creating fun places and sort of increasing the competition for others to do that. So we start to get hip now. And then now, as we've come out of the pandemic, The big question for everybody is, what is the office actually for these days? What are we going to be using it for? Because the function has changed since before in these last 2 years. So I was talking with Tony before, and he was saying that there was a major company that he's working with, and they've actually consolidated all of their offices. So now maybe a tenth of the personnel are able to fit in the office on any given day. So there's all this scheduling. And so you really have to start coordinating with your team, right? This multimodal way of working suddenly becomes very important and very complicated. Now, the other thing that has started to happen, sort of the consequence of the way that we're working, this multimodal way of working, and the tools that we're using, is that there has been a significant increase in the number of messages being sent back and forth. And this back and forth messaging is kind of how we know that work is getting done, right? It's almost like a presence. It's like a virtual office in a way. It sort of creates a presence on our team. And the statistics show that we check our inboxes about once every 6 minutes, and we check our instant message system about once every minute. So, so this form of presence really ties us to our inboxes. And it seems like almost when we're not tied to our inboxes, that work isn't going to get done. And Cal, in his newest book, A World Without Email, which I highly recommend, one of the best books I've read in recent years, he calls this phenomenon the hyperactive hive mind, right? This ping-ponging of messages back and forth. And in the past, we had one ping pong table, right? We've got our interdepartmental memos. We might have a phone, but we've got like one or two ping pong tables. Now we've got WhatsApp, Twitter, LinkedIn, Teams, Skype, all the different tools. So we're suddenly playing ping pong on 8 to 10 different tables. And most of us are knowledge workers, and this constant context switching between our work and our messaging system is what Cal calls a cognitive catastrophe, which I really like that. So we need time for thinking and focused work, and this constant ping-ponging of messages is not allowing for the type of deep focus that most of us need. So in this hybrid environment, we need to change how we're working to have better workflows. And I'm going to describe that in a second. Because it's a little bit of an abstract concept. So in this recent GitLab catalog survey, it shows how many work applications are sending notifications. So you can see that the average is about 6 applications that we're getting notifications from. And then how often do people reply to notifications outside of working hours? It's 30% are doing it every day. Another 30% are doing it most days, right? So this hyperactive hive mind phenomenon is not just during work, it's sort of constant, which is why this on versus off is so important. And here we are. I find it difficult to switch off because I'm preoccupied about thinking with what I'm doing has 36%. And the next one is I get notifications on my phone or laptop, right? So it's really tough for people to turn off. And how you signal to colleagues that you're online and working is that you're replying to messages, right? So this hyperactive hive mind behavior is actually really is really exhausting everybody. And what we saw during the pandemic was that burnout was the issue. And this is why this sort of phenomenon, this hyperactive hive mind. So instead of trying to keep up with messages, which is impossible to do anyways, we need to change how we work. Now, and what I mean by that is we have to improve how work flows between people so as to minimize the number of messages going back and forth. And I'll say that the hyperactive hive mind is so convenient that any alternatives that we come up with are at first going to be less convenient. So it's going to feel like a struggle to change the workflow. But I'll give you one example of a team that did this just so to make it a little bit more concrete. And that is there was somebody as a small team, and they had a large number of projects. So it was like 5 people on a team, and they had 25 different projects. And they were constantly messaging each other to keep up on the updates of what was going on the projects. Once learning about the hyperactive hive mind, what they did is they created a dashboard of projects. They used Trello, but the tool doesn't really matter. They used a Trello board, created a dashboard of all their projects, And now anytime somebody needed to ask a question or find out the status, all they had to do was go to the Trello board and check out what was going on. So that is one way that they decreased the number of messages going back and forth. Consequently, they also decreased the number of meetings that they had from twice a week to twice a month. So that's another way with hyperactive hive mind. So that's what I mean by we need to improve our workflows. And one of the things that we know about workflows is that a good workflow makes it easy to review who's working on what and how it's going. So that's sort of one of the major things to improve on. Now, it's not just messages, though, that are a problem. It's also meetings, right? One of the big thing in this hybrid world is that we are in meeting overload. And many people are spending over 20 plus hours a week in virtual meetings. And we know, one, it's not healthy because we're just staring at the screen. And two, it's exhausting. One of the things that we've seen with brain science is that we really need to take more physical breaks in between meetings. So this up here, this is 4 30-minute meetings right after each other without any break, and the red indicates levels of stress. So you can see that as you go through the meetings that the brain's getting more stressed. And then by the fourth meeting, I'm not sure what happens. I think we're just so tired we start over. I'm not sure, but the level of stress decreases there in the fourth meeting. But then here below, this is 4 30-minute meetings with a 10-minute break in between. So you can see that the science really does show that breaks are important. And then not only breaks, we need to the next step in terms of meetings is to evaluate, do we really need that meeting to begin with, or can part of the conversation be done differently? Right? So there's a whole bunch of different ways to organize meetings. When I worked at Management 3.0, we had a rule that there were no meetings allowed. And if you wanted to have one, you had to convince people to come. So it'd have to be like, okay, Judy, I really need you there because you're the only person that knows about client X. And Lonnie, I really need you there because you're the graphic designer, right? So I would have to convince people to come to my meeting. Another team has decided that they only need to meet when they have enough topics to meet about. So they keep a list of topics, and when the list gets a certain length, then they schedule a meeting. But until then, they just sort of keep things on the list. Other people are recording meetings or recording clips from meetings, right? We need to go a little bit more asynchronous in a conscientious way, because of course we don't want to replace meetings with hyperactive hive mind behavior. That's not the point. The point is to improve the workflows overall to decrease the messages and the meetings that we're having. And I just noticed that something's in the chat, so I just want to I can confirm that the only off time is sleep. Yeah, we can change that, but we have to control it, right? That's the hard part, is we have to be disciplined ourselves. When I worked in the office, the 9 to 5 schedule, that was the discipline that I needed. Now doing it on my own is a much different situation. So the idea is we want to reduce the number of meetings that we need, and at the same time, improve the meetings that we're having. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too deeply into meeting improvements. What I am going to say is that good online meetings depend on good meeting design, excellent infrastructure, and good facilitation. And the best book that I've seen on hybrid meetings is by Karen Reed, Suddenly Hybrid. It is an excellent, excellent book. So I can highly recommend reading that to get your hybrid meetings better. All right, so I spent a lot of time on modifying how we could communicate, and I promise that the rest will go very quickly. I'm going to just breeze over that, but I did want to mention a couple of things. So in terms of defining normal behavior, one of the things that is really catching on right now, okay, let me start over. In terms of defining normal behavior, a lot of us are going back to the basics and trying to figure out what is it that we need in order to be productive. And the consequence of that is people are creating personal user guides. And I'm seeing this more and more. So I want to post in the chat, I'll post a copy of mine, the personal user guide for me. And at the bottom of my user guide, you'll see examples of many other user guides. So you can get some different examples of that. And this is just, I've written in my own guide here, what are my time zone and working hours? What are my communication preferences? How I like to receive feedback, some of the values that I hold, right? Just a little bit more about working with me. I've got another picture here, an example of somebody who's done it in a graphical format. This was a graphical designer. This is a little bit about him. And the nice thing about user guides is it's not just for ourselves, but it's also helpful for our team to read these and to know about that. In the end, it ends up being a team building activity. So of course, because we have this multimodal way of working, just because we create a personal user guide doesn't mean that we're going to get anywhere, right? We want to create a team agreement together to outline as a team what is normal behavior for our team and how are we going to work in this multimodal way. And I highly recommend I'll send you a copy of the Collaboration Superpowers Team Agreement. And then the other one that I would highly recommend is the GitLab Handbook. And the GitLab Handbook is huge, but they're the largest remote company in the world, and they've got their entire operating system in this handbook. And this is what new employees at GitLab get all the time. Excuse me, this is what new employees at GitLab get when they first start. And they're taught how to search the handbook because it's 14,000 pages long. So it's actually an enormous one. So this was the GitLab Handbook. My buttons aren't quite working. So ultimately, the purpose of the team agreement is one, it's to outline what's normal behavior for our team, but it's also the building blocks of trust, because what we know is that trust is a function of reliability, consistency in the quality of work that we deliver, and responsiveness. Can I find you if I need to? So when we have these outlined, we've got the building blocks of trust on our teams. And from there, it gets more complicated than that, but I don't have time to go into too much detail from there. But what I know is that the personal user agreements, they're really fun to create for ourselves. They're very useful for our teams, and then getting together and putting it together in a team agreement is useful for everybody and just helps make things a little bit more smooth. All right, now in terms of presence, I've just got a couple more minutes left, and I just want to talk a little bit about presence because this is one of the major areas that things are changing. And what I keep saying is that we need to explore new ways of being present on a team, because the old way of being face-to-face in the office is just not going to be the reality moving forward. And now with technology, there's some awesome things on the market. To start with, though, I want to say we know that high-performing teams are not based on physical presence. That has been proven. There's enough examples of high-performing teams out there that we can say this definitively. Now it's just a matter of trying to figure out how do we make it work for us and our teams. And one of my favorite quotes from the interviews, I use it in every presentation, comes from Agile Bill Krebs in the United States, and he says, people think that they want to be co-located, but actually what we really want is high bandwidth communication. We want to be able to talk to each other as if we were in person together. And like, we kind of want it to be like Star Trek, right? Instead of scheduling a meeting, I want to be like, Lisette to Judy, report. And from anywhere on the ship, Judy comes in and she's got a report, and there's no barking dogs or screaming children in the background. It's just crystal clear communication. Now, we don't want to be always on with the push to talk, but we do want it to be easy to communicate with each other. And then what I like to say is we're redefining what face-to-face means right now. And in fact, there's a whole term for it. It's called extended reality. So it's not virtual reality, it's not augmented reality. All of that fits into the extended reality bucket. And there's some fun ways of doing that. My favorite way is, of course, through virtual offices, because it's a 2D way of creating 3D presence in some ways. So these are virtual offices that you can go to through your browser or the app, whichever you decide to use. And you can see that there's all these rooms here and that there's individual people in rooms. You can only see and hear the people that are in the same room as you, but I can double click and go to another room and just talk to whoever's in that room. So this is one way that people are creating presence with each other. Here's another example of another virtual office. This one has different floors. So what I like about Welo and this one is that we don't have floors. That was sort of one of the great equalizers of the pandemic, is that there were no top floors and bottom floors or IT crowds, right? It kind of leveled the playing field, and I really like that. The other one the other technology people are still playing with is telepresence technology, right? You've got the Suitable Technologies office where they had 50% of their workforce in the flesh and 50% beaming in via robot. We've of course got virtual reality, which has come a long way in the last 2 years. If you haven't tried it in the last year, it is mind blowing what is possible. Meet and VR is my favorite virtual reality software, but there's a lot more out there. Within minutes of putting on your Oculus Quest, you can be in a meeting room floating above Earth and space where people are to the right and to the left of you. Absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. And then the last thing that I'll mention is holograms. And if you haven't seen the Microsoft HoloLens technology, again, absolutely incredible. I'll put a link to this video in the chat so you can explore it later. But what is possible is really amazing. So what we know now is that these presence tools, they are expensive. Like holograms are really expensive now, and it's somewhat clunky. Like telepresence and virtual reality, they're really good, but it still feels a bit clunky. But don't worry, we will get there. And I'd say in the next 5 years, this area of extended reality is really going to explode. And if you want to explore more of the tools for that, there is an app for anything that you need out there. And I've got a special tools page on the Collaboration Superpower site that you can explore. It has hundreds and hundreds of tools there. I'm not affiliated with any of these tools. I'm just a fan making a collection. So, all right. So we're nearing the end here. I promise I've only got 1 more minute. So what we know is that navigating a hybrid work environment really depends on modifying how we communicate, defining normal behavior, and exploring new ways of being present on teams. Now, there's one more thing that I want to mention. I am a big fan of Columbo. There's this one more thing, and that is I want to talk about team building right now. And because team building, when I did a recent survey, connection is the thing that everybody seems to be struggling with, creating personal connection with each other. And so what I've been working on is a model for the connected hybrid leader, where I'm trying to figure out in this hybrid space, what are the ways that we can actually create connection with each other. And what I found is that connection happens when we pay attention to each other, and we need to find ways of paying attention to each other on a daily basis. So this doesn't mean that we have to have pizza parties and quiz nights, actually far from it, but it does mean that we need to organize ourselves in a way that we're creating room for personal connection on a regular basis. And so we start out with like, who are we, right? As a leader on a team, we want to learn who are our team members. What do we know about our team? For this, the personal user guides come into play, where people are telling us what we want others to know about us, right? Then we need to figure out, what does the team need? And this is an interesting question. And in fact, I think one of the most important questions when we talk about team building is asking, what do you need to feel connected on a team? That is a super important question, because often the answer comes back in a surprising way. Most people don't say, I need pizza parties and I need quiz nights and I need virtual yoga sessions. In fact, when I asked my team, my colleague said, I need more accountability. You keep feeding me an endless list of tasks, and I want someone to check in on me. So for her to feel connected on the team, she actually needed more accountability. That is a far cry from a pizza party. The next aspect is, how do we work together, right? This is where the team agreements come in. The next one we have to ask is, what does success look like and how do we measure it? And then the last category is, what do we get when we get there, right? How do we celebrate? What happens when we achieve success? So all of these factors contribute to personal connection and that feeling of socialness on a team. It's not just one thing, it's not one event, it's what we do throughout the day and how we organize ourselves that creates personal connection. All right, so what we know, undoubtedly, the future of work is choice. And it is absolutely in everybody's best interest to make it work, the employee and the employer, because when we make it work, the payoff is huge. We as individuals get the maximum amount of freedom to design our schedules around the things that we love and our own productivity. And companies get a stronger and more connected workforce that is not dependent on location. And in order to do that, in order to not go back in time when we go back to the office, we need to modify how we communicate, define normal behavior, and explore new ways of being present on our teams. And with that, I've gone over 6 minutes. I really appreciate the time and the engaged attention. And I'm going to just end it with that. And so, since I've been talking to the experts out there, I don't know how many actual questions there are going to be, since you're all experts. But I'll if we have time, we can open it up for questions.
We certainly do. We certainly have time. Feel free to ask some questions, team.
Or just let's have a conversation, since everybody here has enough expertise.
I love your comment about connection, and one of the things we've struggled with people being remote, especially with COVID, was mental health. And people, when you're in the office, you could see someone struggling, but as a manager, when they're remote, you may or may not pick up whether there was mental health issues. And as you say, just having a meeting for a meeting's sake to try and determine if someone's got, you wouldn't know. But I love the way you've put the connection in and how you could build on that to get to people to connect better. And maybe you could pick up more on if they're struggling or not, because you won't get it from a work thing. It's something you may see or feel going on rather than necessarily a work thing.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to tell. I mean, depending on my boss or my manager, right? You wouldn't want to divulge that to a team necessarily, depending on the team.
No, people just, we just didn't get anything. You'd get crickets. So you'd get no interaction, and then you'd find out later that that person was struggling, or there was generally more than one person. And it's not something sometimes you pick up in a one-on-one, especially if you're a newer boss and you haven't yet got that trust with those people.
I want to say, I wanted to leave room for others to say. No, I have to say, the one-on-ones I think have become critical in this environment. And one of my friends actually was visiting, and he was working in an environment where they were in person before the pandemic, and now they're trying to get everybody back to the office, but compliance is low. And he just switched teams, and he was saying to me, if I know that my boss has got my back, the rest is gravy. For him, it was just like if they know that the boss is supporting him and will stick up for him, and he's like, nothing else, the work, the conflict, nothing else mattered. So I really thought the one-on-ones for leaders, that's a critical thing. Just checking in. You don't have to get personal even.
No, well, the challenge we've seen is, like, we had one stage, one manager had an exorbitant amount of one-on-one direct reports, and they'd be all the time in one-on-ones with nothing else. And it was in a time of change and leadership changeover and things like that. And it was saying, like, this personal connection. And I love the way you say find out what they want, because what I might want as a person, like, I might just be happy with how are you going, you've checked in on me, I'm fine, or someone else wants something completely different. So
yeah.
And I think the interesting thing that we've seen is also the availability of the leaders. Like you say, one-on-one, and that's true. But I think it's also the availability of leaders to just have a conversation with, or go to the leader and go, I have a problem. Now, how do you do that when you're in remote? One of the ones that we've seen is Craig, who's known to a number of us here. He's set up his online sharing platform, and he has a foyer, and he actually has that open and is sitting in that foyer and has an open door policy while he's working. And if someone comes into that foyer, they know that they can get his attention, and he's happy to put down, and it's basically, okay, you have my moment of time so that I can give you what you need. So I think that's an interesting thing that we're seeing as well.
Yeah, that's where maybe that virtual room, you could, as a manager, you could say, right, I'm going to work, and I'm going to put time to work, but it's work that I could have the door open on, say, virtually, and just say, look, if you want to talk to me or that, you can come into the room and have a chat with me, type thing. And other times, no, you have the door shut because you can't, but you make time for it as well.
It's interesting. A lot of the organisations I've been working with, managers have a 40-hour week of meetings. They couldn't possibly do their work in an open office because they've already got a complete week of meetings. That's before they had any one-on-ones. And it really is, they have to change the way they work or they are doomed.
Yeah,
And
it's not sustainable. Like 40
it's
hours
just
a
not
week of
sustainable.
meetings.
And
That's
then,
madness.
you know, they might have 30 direct reports. They're in meetings all week. They can't do any of the decision making that should be their job. They can't do any of the talking to the people and building the trust and all those things and being available because they're simply not available. So in terms of working out, well, which is the first problem to solve, I suspect it really is that clear the meetings out of the calendar is such an important problem because it enables everything else to happen. But if they only clear the meetings out of the calendar and don't do the other stuff, I loved your talk, by the way, Lizette. It's such a beautiful summary of what needs to be addressed. Yeah.
You're so kind. You have to say that. No, but I think what comes to mind for me when you're talking about this is that this is the prime example of hyperactive hive mind behavior, right? This is like old school workflows being applied to the modern environment, and it totally doesn't fit. It's like we're going back and commuting. Like commuting just doesn't fit anymore. And the way we worked before, it just doesn't fit anymore. And I think that's one of the, I mean, I don't know how they're going to scale this, right? Like this 40 hours of meetings a week. How would you scale that? Anyway, Lonnie.
They can't.
I think I agree. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is really help people design their day and their week a lot better. And, you know, because yes, I could easily attend 40 meetings a week if I choose to. But being really purposeful around what is the meeting and whether it should be a meeting or it can be done, you know, through, you know, a channel like Teams or Slack or something, but also about, you know, this is a time for leaders to step up, and step up is role modeling how you're spending your time. And so, you know, I'm assuming, rightly or wrongly, my boss is designing her week so she can get the work she needs to do, she can see the people she needs to see, and she can learn. And so, you know, there is set time in her calendar. I know I can't disturb her because she's training or learning. And so I think this is the time to really step up and step out and demonstrate, yes, the world's changed, but we can adapt to that.
And it'll be better for everybody when we do, right? Like having more time and for deep work in our calendar. But I agree with you. Like, I think that I think the meat of the issue lies in leadership right now and leaders understanding how to behave. Because one of the things that I'm seeing in lots of companies is that leaders are making rules and then not following the rules themselves. Like they're requiring people back to the office and not going back to the office themselves. And that right there, if you want to deteriorate trust on your team, that's the #1 way to go. That's the fastest way to get there. I heard last week I was in a meeting with somebody and the woman said she was on the call with, it was like it had taken her forever to get a call with her boss. He kept her one-on-one. He kept canceling and rescheduling, like for months he did this. And then they were on a call. And as they were on a call, she got a call from the doctor to inform her that she had cancer. And so her boss was the first one to know before her husband, because he was on the call. He never checked in again. He never came back and checked in again. I mean, right there, wow. You've lost an employee. Like the fact that she hasn't quit it yet is just means that she's distracted. But I see that over, I mean, that's an extreme case. But in that situation, like you can never go back to having a trusting environment again. Like he will have to rebuild from scratch, right? So this is the area that I see needs the most work. I think workers are making it happen, and the leaders are the ones that are really in the hot seat at the moment. Not to put blame on any one piece, but like this is where I'm seeing the issue myself.
No, I concur, and I'm sure I can see others nodding. But you know, working across the world as we do in remote AF, we're seeing that the leadership is the part that's struggling, both from the executive, but that middle enabling, enhancing layer of leadership is crunched between here and crunched between here, and some of it's not their own fault. They're struggling to understand how they deal with it, and I think that's something that we have to help them with as well.
But I think the change is for leaders to start asking that question, themselves. Look, we had how did we get work-life balance? You talk about the deep time and the loft time. And we said, well, if leaders are working till all hours, they're showing that's not helping. So you've got to do it yourself. How can I change? What little thing can I change as a leader to help with that? We don't change it overnight, but you've got to ask those questions. So here is, how can I change how we meet? How can I change how we flow our work? How could I do it? And it might not be a big step at first, but if you keep asking that question, then you'll move on. It's when you just sit there and go, no, I'll leave it to them to do, makes it too hard.
Or I'm too busy. Like, it's getting off the treadmill to like take a step. Like, you've got 40 hours of meeting. When are you going to, also putting a wrench into your workflow? Like I said before, like, you're going to increase the overhead of your team in the beginning. Like, you're going to slow things down in the beginning, and nobody wants to do that, especially as a leader. Like, so yeah, it's a hard move. We're in a hard place right now, but we either have to adapt or we're going to burn out.
I'm going to have to put my hand up here and say it's time to call you and give it a time box, which does perturb me a little bit, because I feel like we could probably go for hours. Listen, I'd really like to thank you on behalf of everyone for spending the time with us and giving us your time. That's been so fantastic. I think everybody that's benefited here, for those that will be listening shortly, because this will go out as an asynchronous in the spirit of everything we've been talking about, and be consumed as well. So thank you so much again for being part of it today.
Oh, it's my honor, and really good to see everybody and meet everybody, and especially Judy. It's so funny, Judy. I have to meet you in Australia to see you these days. No, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the engaged attention.